Policy Forum's new integrated policy approach called a realistic reset. And over the course of the program, we encourage you to live tweet your thoughts and reactions using hashtag realistic reset. So before I introduce our speakers, I'm just going to share a quick video that gives a brief overview of Israel Policy Forum's realistic reset policy approach.
When it comes to U.S. policy on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's time for a realistic reset. There are no quick fixes, especially after the previous administration upended decades of bipartisan consensus on the conflict.
So I'm looking at two-state and one-state.
They released a plan that envisioned Israeli annexation of large parts of the West Bank and cut off all aid to the Palestinians. Now, this is the moment for a focused policy agenda that achieves near-term stability for both Israelis and the Palestinians, advances the interests of both sides, and lays the groundwork for achieving a sustainable two-state outcome. Our agenda has 4 areas of focus: strengthening the U.S.-Israel relationship and Israel's security, rebuilding U.S.-Palestinian ties, expanding Israel's regional integration based on the Abraham Accords, and restoring a political horizon for a two-state outcome. To learn more about a realistic reset, visit israelpolicyforum.org/realistic reset.
All right, so as the link said, we encourage you to check out more on our realistic reset policy approach on our website. The next session of this series will be on May 5th. So please save that date and stay tuned for more information about speakers and an exact time. And in the meantime, this webinar will be recorded and posted online for further sharing. We also want it to be interactive, so eventually we'll get to audience questions. But in the meantime, please submit your questions at the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. And we will also be introducing some polls for the audience. So we'll let you know when to head to a link in the chat to share your thoughts with us and join into the conversation. So with that, I'm very excited to introduce our speakers. Ibrahim Eid Dalalsha is a senior political consultant based in the West Bank. Currently, he heads a private think tank in Ramallah, the Horizon Center for Political Studies and Media Outreach. Ibrahim formerly served as a senior political advisor at the U.S. Consulate General in Jerusalem. Rawan Odeh is the managing co-director of New Story Leadership, a peacebuilding organization that brings young Palestinians and Israelis on a leadership delegation to Washington, D.C. Rawan is a Palestinian American who's lived half her life here in the US and the other in Nablus in the West Bank. So with that, let's jump right into it. Ibrahim, I'm going to turn to you for the first question. What is the status of US-Palestinian relations in this moment? Is the US well positioned to advance its foreign policy goals vis-a-vis the Palestinians, including laying the groundwork for a two-state solution?
Thank you, Alex. Thanks. Hi, everybody. I would like to actually start by actually saying the US is and has always been well positioned to actually advance the Israeli-Palestinian resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In terms of the current status, however, I think, in my opinion, what I'm hearing is that these contacts have been slow, in fact, too slow, and have not yet picked up the required, I would say, momentum to move forward. There are different reasons, and people cite different reasons. Political instability, if you will, in Israel in terms of elections, and the fact that you don't have yet an elected, stable Israeli government. They've had elections, I guess 4 times in a span of 18, 20 months or so. On the Palestinian side, Palestinians are going to elections hopefully as soon as May. And, these have factors among other maybe US domestic issues and preoccupations with coronavirus and other stuff have actually delayed. That's the understanding of resuming in full Palestinian American relations. But the bottom line here is that after the 4 year of the Trump administration, I guess that the new US administration have set things right in terms of the main pillar to re-engage with or pillars to re-engage with the Palestinian people and leadership, starting with re-embracing the two-state solution, which is an important step given the fact that we had like the no state sort of like proposal that was submitted by the Trump administration, of course, that would have never been a starter. And second, like addressing the issues of trying to restore or undo the damage that was created, I think, by the Trump administration, including shutting down the US consulate in Jerusalem. And now there are contacts about reopening the consulate in Jerusalem, resuming aid or humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people, including UNRWA. In addition to that, I know that there are contacts also addressing the not only reopening the PLO office, but in Washington D.C., which was shut down, but essentially trying to fix the status of the PLO. As complicated as this case is, but trying to fix the status of the PLO, which is still deemed a terrorist organization in the U.S. or by U.S. law, despite the fact that it has been a partner to U.S. and Israel in terms of peacemaking for the past 25 years. So that I would say, where things stand. So everyone is optimistic, cautiously, but pending and waiting for outcome of Israeli elections and government formation, and same also on the Palestinian side of the Green Line. So things are set in that way. At least we have contacts. Issues are being addressed. We mentioned the issues that are important to the Palestinians in terms of what the U.S. has to do, what the U.S. administration has to do. I think also there are demands from the U.S. administration, from the Palestinians, which we could talk about later, like in terms of prisoners' payments and incitement and many other issues that I think are on the agenda or on the table in terms of the bilateral Palestinian-American contacts.
Thanks, Ibrahim, for that overview. Rawan, I'd like to turn to you. I know you work with a lot of young Palestinians, and Ibrahim gave a very good overview of sort of from an official standpoint, from the government contacts, how people are feeling about this moment in US-Palestinian relations. In terms of civil society, in terms of the next generation of Palestinians, where are we in this moment in terms of feelings about the future of US-Palestinian relations? Rawan, you're on mute.
A year after the pandemic, and we're still forgetting to unmute. Hi, everyone, and thanks, Alex, for that question. I feel like the younger generation of Palestinians have a similar feeling to half of the US population that are like, good riddance, Trump is gone, thank the Lord. So there's a lot of relief in that regard, just because the Trump administration represented almost the erasing of the idea of Palestinian statehood and sovereignty. And I think some of that is being revitalized back. We haven't really seen statements come out from the Biden administration just yet around what steps he will do differently, different from the Trump administration, also different from other presidential administrations in the USA. I think there's also a sense of, we hear this all the time coming from almost every administration, the majority of members of Congress, we stand behind a two-state solution. And then we look at actions that the Israeli government takes that is in complete opposite, with settlements, with annexation, with the sustained occupation. And I think the younger generation are looking for like real accountability in the setbacks that continue to happen for Palestinian statehood.
Thanks, Rawan. So now we're going to turn to the audience to do an interactive poll. I'm going to send a link in the chat. So those of you watching this, feel free to head to that link to answer some questions. And then later, once everyone has responded, we will look at what people's thoughts were. So feel free to head to that link in the chat. But moving on, I want to ask you, Rawan, about the Palestinian elections. We know that several months ago, President Mahmoud Abbas called for Palestinian elections. And this is for the first time in a decade. And regardless of whether these elections actually happen, as many have speculated that they might not, President Abbas has been in power since 2005 and is 85 years old. So what implications does this have on the next generation of Palestinians? And what figures and groups do you see positioning themselves to be the future leaders of Palestinian society?
Well, when the elections were announced, I think there was almost like, oh, another election that won't happen. But I actually think this time, seeing the election polls, seeing the registration and the PSA around voting in elections gave like a new energy to the Palestinian people about like, wait a minute, we might see a leader that isn't the same person for the past few decades. And I think one thing that I didn't expect to see happen was like all of these new independent tickets. There are about 25 new independent tickets that were mobilized and created by Palestinians that are kind of sick and tired of both main political parties, the Hamas party and Fatah. And I think that just shows that Palestinians are starting to energize. They're starting to see that, you know what, there is a future, we can have ownership. I was very disappointed when I saw Abbas put himself on the ticket. It was like, are you kidding me? Like that totally defeats the purpose of why we're having elections. But regardless what happens, I think the outcome of the mobilizing has created a momentum for Palestinians to start thinking like, what progressive ideas do you want to bring forward? What do we want to outkeep? And the main theme is like anti-corruption. The main theme is a strong Palestinian, foreign policy space where we actually have a platform to speak truth to power. And for me, I think Salam Fayyad kind of represents that. Like when he was PM, he brought a lot of reform and finances and banking and investments, and he wasn't able to move as I think he was too efficient for the PA at the time. But I'm positioning him to be a progressive leader for the Palestinian people.
Ibrahim, do you have any additional thoughts on that? I mean, Rawan's outlook on this seems pretty optimistic. Do you share her optimism on potential for reform, or potential for rooting out corruption from the Palestinian Authority post-elections?
Yeah, no, hello, Rawan.
Hi.
And, obviously Rawan is much younger than myself. So, the hope and the energy that she spoke about, I think are quite fascinating to me. And I really, think that there is a lot of truth to what she described. The only side that I would like to highlight is that the patronage system of power represented in both Hamas and Fatah is too strong still. And if we get to these elections, that would be basically the beginning of a process where if you don't beat, those patronage systems that have been created over, decades, at least you're basically curbing them. So at the moment, I think we are, we've been living under, I'm not going to call it totally dictatorship regime, but I would actually say two patrimonial, if you will, systems that are based on clientelism, systems that actually offer people as much as social security there is in a small entity called the Palestinian Authority or Palestine, both in the West Bank and Gaza. The tickets that Rawan spoke about are, there are at least 27 of them. We only have like 7 mainstream factions, including Fatah, Hamas, and smaller political factions groups. But what's interesting is one thing that is happening inside the ruling party, which is Fatah. And I think we have a new list that is emerging from within Fatah that is aiming itself to the general public as an alternative, popular, trying to earn as much votes from the people, protest votes, people who want to fight and combat corruption and so on. This is emerging, and that's actually a real source of hope. When you think about the Palestinian election system now that is being used, is similar. It's a proportional representation system. So, each of those lists will be, who pass the threshold will be represented. And it actually allows as such, after the elections, for progressive people, professionals, including Dr. Salam Fayyad that Rawan mentioned, and others to ally together. So we're not bound by, either, this side or that side, but actually creating a new political machine to move forward. there are concerns still about whether or not there is a very big and robust debate and discourse right now that is becoming public on the question of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem participation that might actually, if Israel blocks elections in East Jerusalem, then, this could create, in my opinion now, not really cancellation of the elections, but it could actually be postponed. But in order to postpone those elections, you still need all factions consensus, and you still need to take into account, like people's expectations and the momentum. So in other words, what I'm saying is that the train for the elections is set. We still have hindrances, obstacles that I'm hoping will actually be resolved. And if not, then even if these elections are postponed, they're not going to be postponed forever. There's enough momentum to get this train actually moving, even if that happens.
I also want to piggyback on what Ibrahim mentioned about East Jerusalem, because I think it's an important example of where the U.S. policy can come in. If Israel does block East Jerusalemites that identify as Palestinian within their roots, their identity, their nationality, their language, and the majority of their religion, if Israel blocks that, that is direct resistance coming in from a democratic Palestinian process. And that kind of hindering is the things that we've seen time and time again. And I would hope to see the US administration, if that does happen, understand that Palestinians are trying, but when we have an entity that's controlling East Jerusalem that doesn't allow Palestinians the freedom to vote within the territory that they define themselves with, it's like a huge obstacle. I also want to add, for many Palestinians that are really distraught by the amount of corruption, there are many Palestinians that are still like, you know what, I'm not okay with the current PA structure. And until I see real reform, human rights centered practices, laws, LGBTQ rights, I don't want to be a part of that system. And that's a huge population within Palestinian society, those that want to reform, that want to engage, but haven't yet seen the right trajectory take place just yet. And those people are mobilizing in their own ways in civil society, NGOs, like the Tal'at feminist movement that came out against honor killings, and others. So I also want to mention, we're talking about elections, but there's a huge groundwork, people that are mobilizing and working, and I think should continue to work regardless of elections, so we can fight within the system and also outside of it to pressure it to reform in a positive direction.
Oh, that's a really good point. I really appreciate you bringing up that aspect of it, because it really is so much more than the politics and so much more than the political system. Ibrahim, I want to turn to you to talk a little bit about US aid to the Palestinians. We heard 2 weeks ago that the Biden administration announced that it was restoring humanitarian aid to the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza for COVID-19 relief. What specifically does this aid include, and how will this move factor into US-Palestinian relations going forward?
As I said earlier, actually, I think the departure of the Trump administration, the inauguration of the new administration have really set things open to resume Palestinian-American contacts. But things have been, in my opinion, have been too slow so far. The only concrete cut of the aid that I've heard about, at least basically reaching this side of the ocean, is coronavirus-related assistance of $15 million. And that, I think, by itself is not really a precedent, because even under the Trump administration, this did actually come. I think it was about $5 million that went to the category relief services, as was announced at the time. So what I'm trying to say is that the need for U.S. Restoring Israeli Palestinian American relations needs to be, in my opinion, on a little bit faster pace than it has already been. And the scope of assistance that is needed, it's not only, like in terms of, it's crucial, important that you get assistance to combat the pandemic. That's very obvious. But there were large chunks of assistance that were, cut from UNRWA, the Relief for Refugees Agency, plus, like civil society. The Palestinian civil society has actually been the hardest hit by cutting the U.S. Impact. Because, by the way, direct support to the Palestinian Authority has not really been a main feature of U.S. assistance to the Palestinians. So when the assistance was cut, essentially you're talking about, the funding to UNRWA and funding to the Palestinian Authority Security Services, by the way, which was like another thing that the Trump administration did, and it was like disastrous in my opinion. But also the like the civil society. So far we have not really seen. We've heard reports, intense declarations from the administration. But as I mentioned earlier, I think the process has been too slow, and it's pending, certain sort of like political outcomes, both in Israel and on the Palestinian side. So that's, I think, what I can tell you. And I'm not sure that there is, any secretive channeling of assistance that people don't know about or that has not been announced, with the exception, I think, of slow and gradual reinstallation of the U.S. security program to the Palestinian security forces, which has always been there. And even when it was cut temporarily. The only one that survived the mess, I would say, with a minimal level of support and assistance was the security sector.
And Ibrahim, just to rewind for a second, you alluded to, during the Trump administration, a lot of various forms of U.S. aid to the Palestinians was cut, in terms of U.S. aid to the PA, to the Palestinian security forces, to UNRWA. Both of you guys, what do you think what impact do you think these moves had on U.S.-Palestinian relations, and especially in terms of development aid, civil society aid, things like that? Rawan, I'd love to hear your thoughts, or Ibrahim.
Ladies first, so if Rawan wants to go first, that's fine, please.
I mean, the tragic impact was the loss in trust, right? When we saw the cutting of aid, the political moves, like the move of the embassy to Jerusalem, it was kind of like, in a metaphor, like a slap in the face to the people that have been trying hard and in mobilizing themselves to see that the U.S. just walked away and turned its back against the Palestinian people. So I think it's a lot more than aid. And the Palestinian people are very fortunate to have other allies like the EU that stepped in, and other donor countries. But I would truly think the power of the U.S. is beyond assistance. The power of the U.S. is the impact that it can have in steering Israel towards a direction that's more compromising and willing to sit down with the Palestinians in a way that is more equal. So in a nutshell, 4 years of Trump created a loss in Palestinian respect or trust to the American brokerage in the Middle East. And I also think it did push in a more positive way the Palestinians to kind of think, we need to figure this out on our own. We can't rely on other entities to just step in and give us the statehood that we're looking for. But I think, the Palestinians were like swimming not only against the current, but the entire Pacific Ocean. When it comes to the way I have seen in Congress and in the White House, Israel policies being talked to in a quiet room, rather than explicitly no more settlements, explicitly no more human rights violations, explicitly this occupation needs to end. For Palestinians to feel like a U.S. is a partner, for Biden to really step in, human rights can't just be a talking point, it has to be a proper action item. And I think that's where the gap is, really. That's where the vacuum is between Palestinian and U.S. relations, proper speaking out against the injustices that are happening on a daily basis.
Ibrahim, anything to add?
Well, yeah, I just want to tell you that I think the damage that was created for Palestinian American relations was tremendous. I mean, all the points that Rawan spoke about are well valid, but without restoring not only the political contacts or security channels contacts between the U.S. and the Palestinian leadership. When the consulate was closed, basically that was the last, I would say, access and entry point of the U.S. not only politically, but in terms of cultural programs, in terms of engagement with the Palestinian civil society, in terms of even consular services that were offered to the Palestinians. We had a very, and I, having worked for the consulate for 20 years, I can tell you that we had a very solid interaction with all segments of the Palestinian people. In fact, we took on several occasions the Consul General of the U.S., who was once never welcomed in the Palestinian territories, to pick olives with villagers in many of the areas in the West Bank. I mean, we got to a point where really those relations, regardless of political disagreements in certain things and floundering peace process and all of these issues were there, but in terms of the engagement, it was like too profound. I thought that it was very good and was profound enough to actually make a difference. Now we are in complete sort of like, I would say in complete shutdown, started with political boycott, and then it had its impact on all other segments. And it's a must actually to restore. If we're not restoring, a peace process viable with actionable items, as Rawan was actually mentioning, I think we at least need to restore that relationship. And it has been actually, again, as I said, and I continue saying, too slow. But let's keep sort of like faith and actually push for. And that's one of the things that I actually do, whether here or with American colleagues that I actually I'm still engaged with, that these kind of issues or this kind of issue, which is restoring Palestinian-American relations, need to be addressed as quickly as possible, and to go back on the track where you could foresee a viable two-state peace process drive back again.
Great. Well, just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you guys have any questions, the Q&A box is open. We encourage you to join the conversation. You can see some trickling in, and we will start to get to those soon. But before we do so, I'm excited to share the results of our poll. So I'm going to share my screen quickly so we can see how you guys answered some of our questions. So hopefully you guys can see my screen. So this first question, what policies and actions should the U.S. prioritize as it seeks to enhance its relationship with the Palestinians? I see restoring trust, partnership for peace fund. That's a really important piece of legislation that was passed a few months ago. Reforming leadership. We have a few down here as well. Rawan or Ibrahim, do you guys have any immediate reactions to these answers?
I really like the first one about like reopening the consulate in East Jerusalem. Like that is just a very simple, easy step one. Open channels back. So Palestinians and even Palestinian Americans like myself and my family that weren't able to get any services when the consulate shut down. I think the Biden administration should take that. I think the Partnership Fund for Peace, it's also a very, very exciting piece of legislation that works to give, I think, $250 million of aid to civil society. I will say, like, I love it as someone that works in civil society and peace building, but there needs to be more done in terms of statehood building and putting investments and business into the Palestinian private sectors. And there's usually the caveat that it's like, we'll give you money if you also engage with Israeli businesses, or we'll give you money if it's 50% Israeli, 50% Palestinian. And as much as collaboration is great, just having a channel of investments where Palestinians can uplift themselves and their own businesses rather than relying on humanitarian aid could be a great way to move forward. Yeah, Ibrahim, do you want to?
Unless I can't see it, but I would add, I mean, it's great. It's like the perfect list, but reopening the Palestinian sort of like PLO mission in Washington, and in fact, I would say, like upgrading Palestinian diplomatic representation to the U.S. I want to tell you, Alex, if you don't know, regardless of the reasons, but with the signing of the peace agreement between the PLO and Israel, Palestinian PLO officials have turned into VIPs, and they've got like these special permits to move all around Israel and do all kinds of things. Whereas in the US, they remained under restrictions. And I'm not talking about the individuals of the PLO or the PLO officials themselves. I'm talking about recognizing the Palestinian sort of like national identity in ways in the US, diplomatically and otherwise, in ways that would actually boost this relationship. Now we have all grievances about PLO policies, this, that, and the other, but I'm talking about the core issue of actually representing Palestinians in ways that would serve, Palestinian and American bilateral relations, which eventually will benefit both Palestinians and Israelis.
Yeah, I wanna really like focus on that, especially in the space that we're in right now with IPF Atid. In my work in DC, when I go to any kind of conferences, legislative hearings that talk about anything regarding Palestine, Israel, I'm always shocked time and time again that there aren't Palestinian voices. Like for example, when they were cutting Palestinian aid with the ADCA Act, in Congress, the two experts that they had to talk about cutting Palestinian aid was a US former general and an Israeli former IDF soldier and a Brookings fellow. So optics and situations like that in the United States and all of the circles that talk about Israel-Palestine need to have a Palestinian voice present, especially organizations that have those connections already with the Biden administration, with Congress, with other institutions that deal with these issues. If we want to prioritize our relationship, we need help and allies from people like IPF Atid and other organizations that will include Palestinian voices in the meetings that take place that create the policies of the Middle East. You can't say that you don't have a partner when you don't invite us in the room.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, and this is, I think, a big problem in how the U.S. deals with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it was perhaps most evident when Donald Trump announced his Priest of Prosperity plan back in early 2020, and there wasn't a single Palestinian in the room. And I feel like that really just hits that point home of how often Palestinian voices are not brought into these conversations and aren't in the rooms when these decisions are being made. So I'm really glad that you brought that point up. I'm going to head to the next slide for the second question. So these are sliding scale, people agreeing or disagreeing with these statements. In terms of whether the Abraham Accords are beneficial for the Palestinians, the average answer is 3.3, with 0 being not beneficial at all, 5 being incredibly beneficial. I wonder if you guys have any thoughts on that. I know the Abraham Accords did not exactly have a lot of positive feedback among Palestinian societies. So,
no, look, Alex, I want to comment on that because I think that the Palestinian position on the Abraham Accords was completely misread and sort of like misunderstood. And maybe also the Palestinian leadership did not really present it right at the time that the Emirates was the first country to actually sign this accord. The problem of the Abraham Accords is not that it's actually, that Palestinians are against normalization between Israel and the Arab countries. It is because it's basically switching the priorities for the Palestinians, and in fact for the Arab world. The Arab Peace Initiative, which calls for full normalization between Arab and Islamic countries with Israel, is contingent, is a price. It is a price and a prize to Israel once we have a two-state solution and Israel withdraws from the occupied territories. Now, the details and the contours of the peace plan and what exactly will be agreed upon can be debated. But basically, the terms of reference and the prize that Israel will get is to have normalized relationships and contacts with Arab and Islamic countries. When you actually give this away to Israel before anything is done on the Israeli-Palestinian peace track, it simply deincentivize the government of Israel from actually moving forward and making compromises, especially territorial compromises to the Palestinians. That is the core and real problem. It's not the fact that we don't want Israel to normalize relations with the Arab countries. Now, having said that, de facto, these agreements are actually already being implemented and other countries are joining. So for the Palestinians, I think they rewrote their position and now they're trying with the U.S. administration, the new U.S. administration that does not embrace, the Trump ultimate plan and go back to two-state solution, is how to actually connect, how you actually design a new approach that would bring, like the Abraham Accords back to a terms of reference where Israel and the Palestinians need to move forward for a two-state solution. That I think is the real issue. So it's not a yes/no answer. I think the reality is more complex than this. And the trick now is actually how do you bring these agreements to serve Israel interests? Because if Israel is interested only in normalizing relations with Gulf states and keeping the occupation, this is not going to work on a longer term. In fact, not even, it may look good on a short term, but on a medium and a longer term, it won't work because the conflict is really between the Palestinians and Israelis. And any eruption of this conflict will actually have very negative impact on those relations. Regardless, of course, each Arab country has its own interests, but at the end of the day, the core conflict here is between Israel and the Palestinians. I understand the Israeli view that actually says, well, the conflict with the Palestinians is secondary, the conflict with Iran is bigger, so we need to have a strong allies. The Palestinians need to just jump on the train and get along. And they're missing the fact that at the end of the day, what Palestinians are asking for is end of occupation and independence. And once you get that, the normalization process is not only with regimes in the region, but also with peoples of the region, whether it's in Jordan or in Egypt or in Iraq or in Saudi Arabia. It's not only the kings and emirs who will actually sign those pacts, it's actually the peoples. That's what I think would be needed to tackle the Abraham Accords, as positive as they are, but again, they don't serve the real purpose.
Rawan, anything to add or any reactions to either of the two?
Yeah, I love what Ibrahim said about like having a goal of having peace deals among the people rather than just the kingdoms in the Middle East. I think, I have Emirati friends. When the peace deal happened, they were texting me, we stand by the Palestinian people, we care about you, we care about that. Like, this shouldn't mean that the Emirati people and the Palestinian people are now severed. I do think that the PA has a really bad PR strategy, especially when it comes to engaging with the Arab countries. Like when Abbas, whatever, he went off at the UAE, I was like, that's just not the right step. And I wish that the PA wasn't so strong and negative in the public eye. Like that should have happened behind closed doors. And I think that definitely told me as a young Palestinian that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, not only to restore a relationship with the USA, but with countries in the Middle East. And I also do agree with Ibrahim, Israel can have a peace deal with every single country in the entire world, like Wonderland. It won't make the difference that it will with the Palestinian people. You know what I mean? Like, you can't have peace with the entire world, but be in a conflict with your neighbors and wake up feeling safe or secure. I also kind of want to comment on the second poll. Biden will make progress in fostering a political reality that is conducive to a two-state outcome. I hope so. I'm not as optimistic just because I haven't really seen, again, Biden's presidency is probably going to focus on domestic issues and COVID-19 and restoring the pandemic. Everyone kind of knows that. So I don't really see him coming forward and focusing on Israel-Palestine just yet. But like Ibrahim and I said, there are lots of steps that he can take right now that aren't let's go to the negotiation process, but rather towards Palestinian legitimacy, open up a consulate, opening up the PLO mission, and speaking out against the occupation.
Definitely. And I think that's all very much in line with our policy approach, not just jumping back into negotiations, but rather taking concrete steps, what he can do in order to create a reality that's more conducive to a future Palestinian state. So with that, let's jump into some of our questions in the Q&A. We have a question from our friend Jonah Nagy in Boston. He said that he's heard some people say that there's another reason why the current Palestinian leadership is not representative of its people, and it's because it's primarily made up of refugees who returned after Oslo rather than Palestinians who remain in the territories after 48, after 67. How do you think Palestinians feel about this, and do you think that it could change?
Can I take this one?
Sure.
Go for it.
No, I think, frankly, that is an old dynamic. Like in 1995, when the PA was created, all of the PLO returnees, if you will, came back and, under Arafat, and basically the entire system, all the senior basically officials in the system were PLO returnees. Over time, I think that did actually change. I don't really think that today. I mean, yes, we have Abu Mazen who's like, a returnee, if you will, but the entire system is filled with people from from the West Bank and Gaza. In fact, if you look at Gaza, regardless of the political differences now with Hamas or not, the entire leadership there is basically from the Gaza Strip. If you look at the West Bank, many of the senior people who rose up to the top, including Shtaya as a prime minister and the entire cabinet, for example, even PLO, committee members, are from here. So that's an old dynamic. I think the real problem that the people, which Rawan alluded to, we have problems with leadership in terms of rule of law, enforcement, clientelism, corruption, all the issues that frankly not only unique to the Palestinians. The problem with the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian people here is that we don't have the luxury of having a corrupt system. The challenges are much bigger than they are in any regular or normal country. And therefore, I think the change and the desire for change and the hope for change is tremendous and overwhelming among the Palestinians. And this is why they look at the elections as the possible way of actually making and introducing those changes. So I just meant to, answer this question because I think it's really old information and maybe even a stereotype to some extent. And the problem is a little bit more profound than that and real, frankly. It's not just we have a bunch of returnees that they're not representatives. They are representatives. They got mixed with the local population. And by the way, it has been like 25 years. So people who were born in 95 are like now 25 and 26 and 27. And those people, that generation is not yet equipped. That's another problem that we have, is that younger people are not really placed in positions to assume power. They are not even, allowed to vote. I mean, they are allowed to vote, but they're not allowed to actually run in the elections. It's sealed by 28. So the entire Oslo generation and 1.2 million people have never sort of like voted. That is, like the types of problems that we have today are not related to PLO returnees versus West Bank and Gaza. It's actually more profound and more real in that sense. So I would focus on that.
Definitely. Let's see. We have a question from someone named Alexander, who's not me. But they asked, do Palestinians follow Israeli election news? And if so, do they have any hopes or fears in this respect? Rowan, maybe you could take this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think after like the fourth election, now the fifth election, it's not really breaking news anymore. But I think, for me, I'm totally following like the Israeli state turning into a more fascist type of government with the people that I was like shocked to see enter the Knesset in terms of their stances on LGBTQ, their stances on anything human rights. So yeah, it's become a broken record, and Benjamin Netanyahu isn't going to go away anytime soon. But even if there are new people going into the Israeli Knesset for the Palestinian people, until we really see a leader that speaks very vividly and clearly in wanting to restore a Palestinian statehood human rights approach, it's almost like it doesn't really have significance. We're kind of like, we're still in the occupation. The Israeli military isn't going away. Even if they have 25 elections this year, unfortunately.
Ibrahim, anything to add? Or
No, I think Rawan is right on the mark there. I think people look at the Israeli policies more than the Israeli sort of like officials. Israel is turning more and more, has been turning more and more to the far right. And that's not really good news, or like it doesn't really send the Palestinians signals that things could actually move without external help. And with external help, I mean like strong U.S. intervention with both the Palestinians and Israelis to go back to some sort of political process. Because if you leave it to the agenda of some of those right wingers in Israel who get into positions of power, then we're not going to move anywhere. In fact, things could get eventually much worse. In terms of whether people do follow the elections, yes, they do. But as Rawan said, I think even Israelis now are not following the Israeli elections. It's becoming like, it's, but we do. We actually, do, and it matters to the Palestinian people.
Definitely. It's gets tiring after 4 elections, maybe possibly 5. We'll see. Let's see, we have a question from Anonymous. They said, we've discussed the next generation component towards future Palestinian politics, but is there a strong gender dynamic at play?
Oh, absolutely. Ibrahim, I'm going to take this one. I mean, obviously, like in Palestine and around the world, there aren't enough women representation, like having 1 or 2 within the PLO, like Hanan Ashrawi was like symbolized, tokenized, and her voice wasn't valid in many of the ways where it should have been. And I think, I'm looking at the rosters and I don't see Palestinian women in a way that I want to see them represented. And then at the same time, like women like me, I'm like, do I want to engage in a system that is like corrupt? Like that's always the conversation that happens. And I think that's why there are incredibly brilliant Palestinian women and men that are working hard in Palestine and around the world that still aren't engaging in Palestinian politics. Definitely, the gender dynamic is always there. And every time I see a PLO picture and I see 30,000 men and not 1 woman, I'm like, it's sad. And I will continue speaking up against it and telling it like it is and telling them like it is, that they need to include women's voices because we are the future, especially when it comes to peace building.
Definitely. Let's see, we have a question from Israel Policy Forum's Israel fellow Nimrod Novik. Hi, Nimrod. Thanks for joining us today. He wants to know, are outside observers right in pointing out that the fragmentation of Fatah into several lists are 1, placing united Hamas at a major advantage, and 2, sending into the open the post-Abbas succession?
Okay, I'll take this one, but I have to actually say that the fragmentation of different lists or Fatah running through different lists is not necessarily a bad thing, because essentially this again is like a proportional representation system. If you look at Fatah basically being the ruling party of the Palestinian Authority, and you compare it to the situation, and I think there is a lot to compare with the situation in 2006 in terms of images of corruption. People want to have a protest vote. People want to change, but they have no one, they in 2006 basically had no other option except for going to Hamas in a massive protest vote, which led to Hamas getting 74 out of 132 seats. The situation today by the the election system, the election law does not allow one single slate to actually take that huge number of votes or of seats. If we I think have an objective assessment of the situation, you would think that Fatah clientele system will vote for Fatah and the current sort of leadership as is on the ticket, and others from Fatah and from the general population will look at the second Fatah list and third Fatah list as a better alternative. Maybe those guys can actually sort of fix the situation because they're much more capable, they're much more relevant, they are from the leadership, but they couldn't continue with the current system, and as such it provides a viable option for them, and this could actually be a savior. So it's not necessarily good news for Hamas. The only thing is, if you would count on who is going to be the largest PLC bloc, parliamentary bloc, obviously when you have Fatah divided into 3 lists, it's going to be Hamas. That's almost evident. However, because the system does allow those blocs to reunite after elections, then this reality does not have to be doomed, and so to speak, from a Fatah perspective. And that's actually one of the logics one of the logical points that people who split from Fatah in these elections, like Dr. Nasser al-Qudwa, for example, is actually advocating within Fatah and to the general public that he would, be the safety valve for the secular mainstream Palestinian votes. And again, elections are elections, so one needs to see. But I think it's not going to be as bad as it was in 2006, meaning that people will vote massively in a protest vote that will go in a wrong direction, basically to a party that does not represent them as such, but receive those votes as a protest vote. So I wouldn't really worry much about that aspect of those elections. And I'm not sure what about what was the other question about the Abbas succession?
Let me look. Yes, he asked what role this will have in Abbas' succession.
The presidential elections are separate, and that's going to be a singular sort of like vote for presidents who want presidents-elect who want to run in the elections. So it's not necessarily tied to the PLC elections themselves. These are like parliamentary elections, have their own. There will be implications on who's going to win the majority if you ally, a number of secular sort of like lists that could win with Fatah versus Hamas, all of these. But in terms of the election of the president, Hamas has actually announced more than once that they're not interested in fielding a presidential candidate. But still, that's a separate battle that has not yet, is not really, no one really is focusing on it now except for Marwan Barghouti, who declared that he wants to run in these elections. But so far, all the focus is on the PLC elections.
Got it. Let's see, we have a question from another anonymous, and I'm really glad that they mentioned this topic because it was one that I was hoping to get to. They said that the Palestinian Authority's policy of paying Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails has been a major source of concern both in Israel and the US, with critics claiming that it incentivizes terror. So what role do you think that this issue will play in US-Palestinian relations under Biden, and is there any chance that the PA would reform this policy in some way? Or should they?
Yes, I think it's actually this specific issue has been one of the most important, I would say, items on the agenda of the US-Palestinian contacts. It's an extremely important issue. But there are two facts that I think have been missing from the Israeli and from the even from the American, I think, consideration. There is no evidence whatsoever that paying prisoners and families of martyrs killed by the Israeli military, whether as they initiated attacks or as victims, like last night in Ramallah, we had a man and his wife basically shot. The man was shot and killed just simply because he failed to stop at a checkpoint. The issue here is that containment of those families and preventing them, like helping them not to actually fall into impoverished poverty and being victims to groups that want to use them for violence and for renewed conflict with Israel is an important fact. Those payments have never stopped since 1965, basically, but since the creation of the Palestinian Authority in 1995, and it never became an issue until 2015 and on. There are some inequalities in the law that actually give more money to people who have spent more time in Israeli jail, and that was seen and translated into you pay those who kill more than those who don't. There are flaws in the system that need to be tackled, that's for sure. But saying that these payments are basically to promote violence against Israelis is completely off. And I think if we go into it from a security perspective, you will see that there is more good than actually bad. Evidently, statistically, when you actually pay those people, you contain them within the mainstream line of the Palestinian Authority that actually coordinates on security grounds with Israel on a daily basis. And there has been no proof that people who take those checks are the ones who are actually carrying out attacks. So regardless of that I meant to mention those 2 points just to put things in perspective, that we need to fix the system, yes, but and it needs to be part of the discussion both with Israel and the US, yes, but it can't be that Israel, for example, punishes the PA by deducting 52 million shekels a month, which is like about $15 million a month. That's about $180 million a year. And it actually requires or demands the Palestinian Authority to stop those payments, but without actually sitting on a table to discuss all the issues and all the other grievances that the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian people have. What I'm saying is that this is a difficult issue, but I think it's a solvable issue if we have a track, if we have not only a solo issue that needs to be addressed and discussed, because people don't understand the implications of it. There are security implications to this. If you stop all those payments to all those, we're talking about thousands of people, frankly. Under the Israeli-Palestinian reality, 1 million people, 1 million Palestinians have served in Israeli prisons since 1967. So if you actually, abandon those people and dump them, the fact that they could actually react, including violently to this, that you are creating a big pool of people who are vulnerable to temptation, whether it's actually financial or ideological, and taking things away in a different direction these issues need also to be discussed. It's not that you switch a light off and on and say, if you're serious, you do it this way. It requires a much more profound discussion and addressing all these aspects of it. And to do that, you need to sit on a table, that includes the Israelis, not only the US.
I kind of want to add, kind of to what Ibrahim says. I think in the way that I've seen this rhetoric being discussed on Capitol Hill and in American circles, it kind of frames Palestinian political prisoners as only murderers, and it forgets the large majority that have been imprisoned because they wrote poetry. And other freedom of speech that has been impeded, or Palestinians that were imprisoned because they protested peacefully or organized peacefully. And so I just want everyone to be aware that the Palestinian political prisoner issue is not one that is stereotyped as the Palestinian terrorists. It's much deeper than that. There are 500 Palestinian children in Israeli detainment today. So when we talk about Palestinian prisoners in relation to this context, we need to talk about how do we get those 500 kids out of prison? How do we have conversations about releasing political prisoners that were a part of, the conflict that happened? We don't see the way that Israel treats Israeli soldiers that act violently towards Palestinian having anywhere near the same sentencing as we've seen in cases in the following years. So I want to mention that, and just also reference that it's also kind of a social security issue. When we have mass prisoners going into Israeli jails, the families are the ones that pay the cost, the wives, the children, the mothers, the grandmothers. So it is a much more nuanced conversation, like Ibrahim said, and it should be discussed, and it should be discussed with Palestinians in the room.
Definitely. Really appreciate both of those answers. Let's see what questions we have left. We have a question from Chaim and Gail Bober, who are actually my grandparents. So good to see you guys on the call. They want to know if there are any changes that are needed in the educational system. I assume that means the Palestinian or possibly the Israeli education system as well, to promote different resolution to the conflict.
As a Palestinian that went through the Palestinian educational system, I will tell your grandparents, yes, we need reform, but it's more in the context of critical thinking, freedom of speech, and things that really promote Palestinian young leaders to think critically about everything in relation to their lives. I know that there's also another stereotype that I hear in almost every conversation I go into about the Palestinian educational system teaching Palestinians how to hate and kill. And I know that there were examples that Hamas has done, but just to be clear, the Israeli Educational Ministry approves all Palestinian educational materials. They have to approve every single book, text that is introduced into our system. And at the same time, both Israeli and Palestinian educational system, when it comes to the conflict, is from a very historical standpoint. So I agree. We learn about the 1967 war, the 1948 war. We learn about everything that goes down, but we don't talk about the future or what it means. We don't even talk about the present, actually, and what that represents for us in our school system. So totally agree with that.
Really good to hear. Let's see, we have, unless Ibrahim, you have anything to add, we have one more question from Nimrod Novik, and he wants to know if there are any emerging promising young leaders in the Palestinian political system, or if any of them are running on any lists, any of the mainstream lists in the upcoming PLC elections.
Can I, Alex, can I just, before I go into that, I want to sort of comment on what Rawan said.
Please.
The education system that I went through was actually under the Israeli civil administration way before the PA authority was created, way before the Oslo Accords. Okay, I'm old enough to remember, like every single book that we had was basically stamped by the Israeli civil administration. But I can tell you that, and Rawan has been through the, she looks much younger. She is much younger than myself, and as such, she's been through the Palestinian education system. But both of us are Palestinians or patriots who want independence, who want freedom. We don't hate Israelis or Jews. We basically want our own national identity. Frankly, I don't really think it's as relevant to focus on, we need the Palestinian educational textbooks to be right on the mark before we move. We need to have history lessons that will teach like Palestinians and Israelis, the day that an agreement was signed, the day that the Israeli army pulled out, the day that we actually created a better future. Because if we continue to talk about these issues as the crucial strategic issues and just neglect and deny and refuse to move forward because of them, we'll continue in this debate forever. It's not, I'm a Palestinian who actually, who has the right to the Holy Land, the Palestinians or the Jews? I mean, let's talk about this for like the next 5,000 years. That is not going to solve the issue. You know what? I was hesitant, but I have to say, there are Israeli Arabs who were born in Israel, educated the Israeli system, but they still have grievances against Israel. And they still support the Palestinian right of self-determination in a two-state solution. So that is not going to solve it. Even if you teach us the Israeli textbooks, we will continue to be a different nationality, a different, character, national character, and you need to reconcile with that fact. That's as simple as it is. That's my comment. Sorry, I didn't
I'm really glad it.
But I remember the days when I was, in school, and Rawan just, brought that to my mind.
I'm really glad you did, because I want to add another point that I forgot about education. Like, when I step out of my house in Hawara and I see Israeli soldiers detaining children, and I see checkpoints, and I see the daily injustices that happen, that is my education to how I see the Israeli army treating me. So if we want to give a more positive look on the way Palestinian-Israeli interactions can look like that's step one, because we wake up every day and we see injustice. And until that changes, like Ibrahim said, that's where we get our interactions. All we see is Israeli army as Palestinians. We don't see anything else. We don't see the people in Tel Aviv or in Haifa. We don't see that. We just see military violence and guns.
Great point. I'm glad you mentioned that. And if you guys want to answer the last question on the emerging leaders in Palestinian society, if any of them are running on any of the lists in the upcoming PLC elections.
As I said earlier, I think I want to be hopeful, but again, I think the process of change is, whether it's social change or political change, is slow. I don't think that there will be major change in the Palestinian political system here, simply because, again, we have two huge patronage systems that are competing on these elections. Voices, democratic, progressive voices, and the desire is tremendous to actually make a change, and you see that in the number of lists that we have out there. However, I just want to be as realistic as possible and have an objective view or insight into this, and basically say that we will most likely have curbing of the full control system that we have right now in the West Bank and in Gaza, separate as they are, but in terms of how they control their respective situations. And there will be new voices that come in. We will have hopefully that once elections are held, we'll have an elected legislator. One of the things that have been happening here is for the past 15 years, we had like one president basically issuing presidential decrees, determining every detail, every law, canceling laws, amending laws, introducing new laws by the will of one sort of like one man in terms of like the president's decree, which is granted to him by the PA Constitution. But the fact that you have no oversight and no legislator had caused tremendous damage. So what I'm saying is this is going to be a step towards fixing this situation, and I don't really see it as like a whole out political change in the Palestinian elections.
Yeah, I want to add to kind of, what's the word, rebuke? Yeah, I think rebuke the myth that like one leader will arise from the ashes and lead Palestine to statehood. I don't think one person will do that. I think millions of Palestinians that are now waking up and seeing their leaders telling them you can create independent tickets. I, as a Palestinian, had no idea that that was possible, that I would be allowed to do so. And so what we're seeing now, people are like, who's the one? Who's the progressive leader? We'll know in the next months and years to come. I am still learning about the different 27 tickets and who they are and what they represent, what their values are. And so to everyone, I will say, like, curiously optimistic in who arises, and just know that you can't expect one person to create change. It always comes with a group of people with great ideas. Yeah, that's just my point.
Thanks so much, Rawan. That's a really great note to end on. So with that, I'd like to say thanks to you both, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Dalia for some closing announcements.
Thanks so much, Alex. And thank you, Ibrahim, and thank you, Rawan, for this wonderful conversation. I'll just send some quick announcements before we let you all go this afternoon. I just sent some links in the chat, but we've got a couple opportunities coming up with IPF Atid and with Israel Policy Forum. First, I'll mention the Israel Policy Forum is holding a briefing in about 20 minutes, starting at 2 p.m. Eastern, focusing on Arab-Jewish political integration following the 2021 Knesset elections. So if you are in the mood for more Zoom today, there's that coming up shortly with the link to register in the chat. And then tomorrow evening on Clubhouse, some IPF Atid lay leaders are hosting a discussion on the Oscar-nominated Palestinian short film, The Present. That'll start at 8 p.m. or 8:30 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. So if you're on Clubhouse, the app, and you want to join that conversation, you can check out the IPF Atid Club on Clubhouse. Also on Clubhouse on Thursdays, we've been doing weekly deep dives. So this Thursday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern, we will discuss Israeli security, politics, and more with David Halperin, the executive director of Israel Policy Forum. And then 2 weeks from today, our Women in Peace and Security channel will be hosting an event with Susan Sloan, the author of A Seat at the Table, and we'll be discussing the role of women in diplomacy. I know we sort of talked about it today, so if you're interested in more of that, anyone is welcome to join, whether you've read her book or not. That'll be April 20th at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. The link in the chat is there for that one. And then lastly, as Alex mentioned at the top of the event today, this was the second of our new series to outline Israel Policy Forum's realistic reset policy approach. And the next installment will be on May 5th, and that'll focus on the next pillar of the approach. So keep an eye out in your email for time and speaker details shortly for that, but we will be sure to circulate all of this information in emails coming up. But once again, just wanted to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are. This was so wonderful, and thanks again, Alex, for moderating, and Rawan and Ibrahim for your time.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for listening.
Bye.
Thanks. Thank you both.